The husband is the head of the wife as Christ is head of the church. What does that mean? Well, I want to read to you a little story, and I just got this amazing little testimony called Do You Love Me? I just got this the other day, and I was reading it on the plane coming down yesterday, and I thought, I've got to read this passage from this man's testimony. This is a man who had 7 children, and they lost number 8, and he tells about what the loss of that baby, just through miscarriage, did. As he held this tiny baby in his hand, it changed his whole perspective on life and what his responsibility was to his family and everything else. And that's what the story is. I can't read you all that. But he says, one of my friends, when confronted at the end of his long work day with his wife's complaints about the noise, the troubles, and the unending housework, snapped back at her in exasperation. Well, what do you want me to do? Stay home and do the housework while you go off to the office? You understand his point. He couldn't solve her problems. What did she want him to do? I'll tell you. She wanted him to listen, to understand, and to sympathize. She wanted him to let her know that despite her problems, her exhaustion, her dishevelment, and who of us wives can't relate to that, he loved her. To let her know that it caused him sorrow that she was suffering, and that if it were possible, he would change it for her. That's all she wanted. And yet, that's everything. She knew as well as he did that hers are the perennial problems of wives and mothers, and that there is no avoiding them. These problems can't be eliminated or even really diminished in their frequency or their burdensome character. But we men can make them easier for women to bear. Jesus said, "Come to me, you who are tired and overburdened. I will give you rest." And that's what your wife wants. She's tired and overburdened. You can't understand why. You don't know what in the world she's been doing all day long when you've been working so hard. But she wants you to say, "Come to me, I love you, I will give you rest." A husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is head of the church. Now, basically, that means one word: sacrifice. And I choose that word rather than love, because love has become a soupy, sentimental, feeble, very much misunderstood sentiment. That's not the kind of love that Christ had for the church. It is a total sacrificial love. Bloody sacrifice is what it meant for him. And there will be no success in a marriage without sacrifice on both parts. When the bride comes down the aisle, she's not bathed in tears because she's giving up her name and her home and her independence and her autonomy and perhaps her family and her whole geography and everything else. She comes down the aisle radiant with joy because there is a face down there that she loves. And all these other things are trivialities by comparison. I love him. I will make any sacrifice. That's what she thinks on the wedding day. And then, of course, where the rubber meets the road is when she finds out that this prize package that she got is a surprise package. And from the day of the wedding, she has to love him because she married him. And the same thing is true of you men. Husbands, love your wives. And I love what Peter says in 1 Peter 3:7, try to understand the wives you live with. I dare say that that's an admission on Peter's part that he didn't really fully understand his wife, let alone his mother-in-law, and we know that his mother-in-law lived with him too. But he says, try. Now, how much have you tried? This little testimony that I have here is a man who just did a complete about face after, I've forgotten how many years of marriage, and began to try. In fact, let me read what he says specifically. He said, in that critical instant, as he was looking at the infant cradled in his hands, I chose the arduous, undramatic, discouraging path of trying to be good. I began holding my tongue. I started admitting my faults. and apologizing. I quit defending myself when I was judged too harshly. As I had made myself the center of my attention for too many years already, I said little about my own labors and sorrows. I sought to know Susan's and to help her bear them. You are to exhibit the love of Christ for his bride, for your wife. Now, I've asked the question, why am I as a wife to submit to my husband? It is because he bears an office. You bear a solemn responsibility in that office. It's God's assignment. It's not your choice. And I know a lot of men that say, well, my wife's really better at organizing things, and she's much more spiritual than I am, so I let her handle the family devotions. And, I don't feel comfortable being the head of the house. God did not make it optional. Now, a lot of us women are naturally manipulators and organizers. In fact, not to make any case for purgatory, I love what C.S. Lewis said about purgatory as he imagined it. He said, I imagine it as a place where milk is boiling over, toast is burning, and crockery is being smashed. The assignment given to women is to do nothing, and the assignment given to men is to do something. And I think that ever since the Garden of Eden, that this has been characteristic. Men would much rather be laid back, they'd rather go down and bowl and let the women do whatever they want to do, even if it's against their will. And the women want to get organized and fix things and, stop the crockery from smashing and the toast from burning and the milk from boiling over. God did not leave the choice with either of us. He tells me to shut my mouth, back off, submit to my husband. And he tells you, husbands, you are responsible. Who was it that God called in the garden after the fruit had been eaten? Not Eve, Adam. And what did Adam do? Right away started making excuses. The woman you gave me. Are you tempted that way, gentlemen? An archetype. Besides Adam, who was laid back and abdicated his responsibility, the archetype in the New Testament is Jesus, of course. But let's also look at the life of Joseph. Almost nothing is said about the character of Joseph, but what he did reveals quite a bit about his character. Surely he used the strength that God had given him not to rule and lord it over and be boss of that little Mary. He used it to love and to protect her, to serve her. We know that Joseph was a laborer. He worked with his hands. He probably did much more difficult work than many men nowadays ever think of doing. He was physically strong. He was morally strong. He was charged with the heavy responsibility of mothering this virgin who was pregnant by the Holy Ghost, and then with the responsibility of fathering, in the earthly sense, that baby. Now, if you ask yourself this, you husbands and fathers, if you were given Joseph's job, literally to mother the Virgin Mary and to father the Lord Jesus, would you do the job differently than the way you're doing it now? Now, Jesus said, inasmuch as you have done it for one of the least of these my brothers, you have done it for me. In other words, whatever I do to another human being, I do to Christ. And whatever I refuse to do to another human being, I refuse to do to Christ. My plane yesterday was 4 hours delayed getting out of Boston, and they ended up finally putting us on a different plane. And I have no doubt that God had a lot of reasons for that. He's engineering a universe, but one little glimpse of how God works things out was that I was seated next to a man who wanted to talk. And I gave him this little leaflet to read since I had just finished reading it, and he began to tell me that his own experience was almost exactly the same, and it had come through a catastrophe in his own life. And we were talking about how different, he was telling me how differently he treated his wife and children since his business had collapsed. I don't know what it may take for men in this modern world to come to their senses, but so often it does take some kind of a catastrophe for us women as well. We're not paying any attention. As C.S. Lewis says, pain is God's megaphone to get our attention. Will you think about the example of Joseph? Then think of the example of Jesus. In Luke 22, you remember that Jesus is talking to his disciples about the fact that he's going to be betrayed and he's going his appointed way, and a jealous dispute broke out about who was going to be the first among the disciples. And Jesus says, "In the world, kings lord it over their subjects, and those in authority are called their country's benefactors. Not so with you. On the contrary, the highest among you must bear himself like the youngest, the chief of you like a servant. Yet here am I among you like a servant." And in John 13, we have that beautiful scene where Jesus rises from supper and takes a towel and washes the disciples' feet. And Peter's reaction was just what yours and mine would have been. "You, Lord, washing my feet?" And he said, "If I, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you must wash one another's feet." That is the authority, the headship of Christ. Humble, sacrificial servanthood. He did not abdicate the position of Lord and Master. He said, "If I am your Lord and Master," which he certainly was, "and I'm washing feet, this is what I want you to do." Now, Jesus was on his way to the cross. And we can get all sorts of highfalutin and high-flown ideas about what we'd like to do for God. But Jesus was telling them one thing that every one of them could do. I'm going to the cross. I am going to be captured and spit upon and flogged and nailed to a cross. Your job, this is what love is. And it says in that first part of John 13, in order to show them the full extent of his love, he washed feet. Do you love God? In order to show the full extent of your love and to bear in humble obedience the authority that God has given to you as leaders, fathers, responsible heads in the world and in the church, you must be servants. You must lay down your life. Well, a husband said to me when he was on the road to divorce, "She won't submit to me." I said, "I have never found a verse in the Bible that says, 'Husbands, make your wives submit.' God says clearly to me, I am to submit." And I've heard wives say, "But my husband doesn't love me as Christ loved the church. How can I submit to him?" So what do we have? A permanent standoff. She won't submit to me. He doesn't love me right. Well, we are miserable offenders, aren't we? We have left undone those things which we ought to have done. We have done those things which we ought not to have done. And there's no health in any of us. And a sinful man and a sinful woman, if they're going to live together 365 days a year, they're going to sin against each other. And there's going to have to be a lot of, "I'm sorry, forgive me." Your wife is weak and sinful. That means you need more patience, more tenderness, more kindness, more sacrifice, the weaker and the more sinful she is. You need to learn to listen, to bear her sorrows, to be faithful and tender and gentle and humble, just like Jesus. He said, "Learn of me, for I am gentle and humble in heart." And don't ever forget that Jesus is exactly like God. He that hath seen me hath seen the Father. Well, this mystery. Why am I to submit to my husband? Because he bears an office. Because I represent the church in the deepest mystery we know anything about. And why is my husband to be my head? Because he represents Christ. It's a drama being enacted in the home, a theater in which the cast of characters has already been decided upon. The wife represents the church, the husband represents Christ. In glorious acceptance, joyful obedience to our respective and quite different roles, we will find fulfillment in marriage, fulfillment in our masculinity, fulfillment in our femininity. A true man is a real man. A real man mirrors the character of God. A true woman is a real woman and mirrors the character of the bride of Christ. God bless you.